The night I saw it, I'd been hauling timber for a Cascade Pacific for 11 years, 2 months, and change. I know that because I'd just gotten my service pin at the company meeting in Hillsboro, the one I almost didn't attend because it meant losing a good run to the Portland Mills. 11 years of running loads from the cutting sites near Tillamook State Forest, down Highway 6, through the Coast Range, in the kind of darkness that city people can't even imagine. The kind of darkness that has weight to it, that presses against your windshield like something alive. I was 43 years old, divorced for 6 of those years, living alone in a single wide outside Vernonia that I'd bought cheap from a guy who'd lost it in his own divorce. The trailer sat on 2 acres of land that backed up against state forest, which had seemed like a selling point at the time. Privacy, quiet, the kind of place where nobody bothered you and you didn't bother them. My routine was simple, the way a long-haul trucker's routine has to be simple or you lose your mind. Drive nights to avoid the traffic, the tourists, the RVs crawling up the Coast Range at 30 miles an hour. Sleep days with blackout curtains duct-taped to the windows of my bedroom. Drink coffee at the Timber Lodge Diner in Vernonia, where a waitress named Carol knew my order before I sat down. Black coffee, eggs over easy sourdough toast, and a side of bacon so crispy it shattered when you bit it. I knew every curve of Highway 6, every pothole, every frost heave, every spot where deer like to cross and where the fog settled thickest in the valleys. I knew the unmarked Forest Service roads better than I knew my own face in the mirror, which was saying something because I spent a lot of time looking at that face during the long stretches between loads, checking if I looked as tired as I felt, checking if I was still recognizable to myself. The trucking life does something to you. People think it's lonely, and it is, but it's a specific kind of lonely that you get used to. You learn to like your own company. You learn to find comfort in the rumble of the engine, the hiss of air brakes, the way the forest opens up around your headlights like you're carving a tunnel through something solid. Some guys listen to podcasts, audiobooks, talk radio that keeps them company through the long, dark hours. I preferred silence. I'd grown up with 3 brothers in a house too small for all of us, and the quiet of the cab felt like a luxury I'd earned. Carol at the Timber Lodge used to say I was the quietest customer she had, which was saying something given the usual crowd. Loggers and mill workers and old-timers who'd been drinking coffee in that same booth since Nixon was in office. But she didn't seem to mind. She'd refill my cup without asking, set down my plate without commentary, and leave me alone with my thoughts in the local paper. I liked her for that. In another life, I might have asked her to dinner. But I'd learned my lesson about relationships. Some people are built for solitude, and I'd made peace with being one of them. The night runs were my favorite, even before everything changed. There's something about driving through the Coast Range at 2 a.m, when you're the only headlights for miles and the stars are so bright through the gaps in the canopy that you forget the sky can look like that. The Forest Service roads were the quietest, the most isolated, cutting through stands of Douglas fir so thick and old that your headlights barely penetrated the tree line. I'd been driving those roads for years without incident, unless you counted the occasional deer strike or the time I had to pull over for a mama bear and her cubs crossing near milepost 28. That was the thing, though. I'd seen plenty of wildlife in those years. Deer, elk, bears, coyotes, the occasional mountain lion sighting, that got everyone in Vernonia talking for weeks. Animals were part of the landscape. You learn their patterns, their behaviors, the way they move through the forest, like they owned it, which, in a sense, they did. I was just passing through. They lived there. So when things started to feel wrong, I noticed, not immediately, not in any way I could have put into words at the time. But looking back, the wrongness began about 3 weeks before the night everything changed. The first sign was the elk. I was running a load down Forest Service Road 1012, the same route I'd taken 100 times when I came around a blind curve and nearly jackknifed, trying to avoid a herd of elk crossing at full sprint. Not the usual cautious crossing, the way elk move when they're aware of your presence, but not particularly alarmed. These elk were running like something was chasing them, eyes wild and rolling, hooves clattering against the asphalt hard enough to throw sparks. A bull elk, easily 800 pounds, slammed into the side of my trailer hard enough to rock the whole rig. I heard him go down, heard the awful sound of an animal that size hitting the road. But when I finally got stopped and checked my mirrors, he was already up and running again, disappearing into the tree line on the opposite side. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes, hands shaking on the wheel, trying to figure out what the hell could have spooked them that badly. Bear? Mountain lion? But predators don't usually drive prey straight across a road toward more danger. Prey animals run away from threats, not through them toward unknown territory. The old-timers at Timber Lodge had their own explanations when I mentioned it the next morning. Coyotes have gone silent, Earl said. He was 73 years old and had logged these forests since before I was born. Haven't heard them yipping at night in weeks. Dogs in town won't go outside after dark neither. My shepherd pissed on the porch rather than step off it into the yard. Mountain lion moving through, offered Dale, who ran the gas station on the edge of town. Big cat can spook prey for miles. But Earl shook his head. Ain't no cat. Cats don't make everything go quiet like this. I wanted to ask what he meant. But Carol came by with the coffee pot, and the conversation shifted to weather and the Blazers and whether the new guy at the mill was going to last the season. The quiet was the next thing I noticed. Not the absence of sound. The forest at night is never truly silent. There's always something rustling, calling, moving through the underbrush. But the quality of the quiet changed. It felt scraped clean, like someone had taken sandpaper to the night and rubbed away all the edges. I mentioned it to Marcus, one of the other drivers, when we crossed paths at the loading yard. Marcus had been hauling timber even longer than me, a big Hawaiian guy who'd moved to Oregon 20 years ago and never quite gotten used to the cold. You ever notice how quiet it's gotten up near 1012? I asked, keeping my voice casual. No coyotes, no owls. Even the crickets seem off. Marcus went still in a way I'd never seen before. He was loading a thermos into his cab, and his hands just stopped moving, frozen mid-motion. I don't take 1012 anymore, he said finally. Since when? He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was lower than usual, like he was afraid of being overheard in an empty parking lot at 4 a.m. A couple weeks back, I was running a light load, empty trailer, just heading back to the yard, and I saw something cross the road near milepost 33. Elk? Bear? It crossed on 2 legs, Victor. He finally looked at me, and something in his expression made the hair on my arms prickle. Moving fast. Too fast for something that size. I told myself it was a guy, some hunter or hiker, but He shook his head. It wasn't shaped right, shoulders too wide, arms too long, and the way it moved. He trailed off, then shrugged with an obvious effort at casualness. I was probably half asleep. You know how it gets on night runs. I told him I knew. I filed the conversation away in the back of my mind, the way you do with information that doesn't quite fit into your understanding of how the world works. Marcus was a solid guy, not prone to imagination or exaggeration. But we'd both been doing this job long enough to know that fatigue plays tricks on you, that you see shapes in shadows, faces in tree bark, movement where there's only wind. I kept driving. What else was I going to do? The loads didn't stop coming, and the bills didn't stop either. The mortgage on the single wide, the alimony I still owed despite the divorce being finalized years ago, the insurance on the rig. It all added up. I couldn't afford to get spooked by elk behavior and a coworker's half-remembered sighting of something crossing the road. But I started paying closer attention to the silence that had settled over the forest like a held breath, to the way my headlights seemed to penetrate less far into the trees than they used to, as if the darkness itself had grown thicker, to the feeling that crept up my spine on the loneliest stretches of road, the certainty that something was watching. The last sign came 3 days before the night my tire blew. I was stopped at a pullout on FSR 1012, taking a leak and stretching my legs after a long haul. The night was cold and clear. Stars so bright I could see the Milky Way stretched across the gap in the canopy overhead. I just zipped up and was walking back to the cab when I smelled it. Musk. Not the clean animal smell of deer or elk, or the sour stink of bear. Something different. Something that reminded me, strangely, of wet dog mixed with something metallic, like copper left out in the rain. The smell was strong enough that I looked around, expecting to see an animal nearby, maybe a stray dog that had wandered into the forest from one of the rural properties. There was nothing. Just the trees, black against the star-scattered sky, and the silence that had become so familiar I barely noticed it anymore. But as I climbed back into my cab, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Something at the tree line, maybe 50 yards away, shifting in a way that didn't match the wind. I stared at the spot for a full minute, my hand on the door handle, every hair on my body standing at attention. Nothing moved again. Eventually, I convinced myself it was a branch, a shadow, my own tired eyes playing tricks in the darkness. I drove on. What else was I going to do? 3 days later, my tire blew on Forest Service Road at 1012 at 2:17 in the morning, and I learned exactly what had been watching from the tree line all along. The tire didn't just blow, it exploded. 1 second I was cruising at 45 through a straight stretch of FSR 1012. The next, the cab lurched hard to the right, and the wheel nearly tore itself out of my hands. The sound was like a gunshot, sharp and sudden, echoing off the trees before the night swallowed it whole. I fought the rig to a stop, the rear end fishtailing on the gravel shoulder, my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. I sat there for maybe 30 seconds, both hands white-knuckled on the wheel, waiting for my pulse to settle. The dashboard clock read 2:17 a.m. The engine idled rough, the only sound in the absolute silence that had descended over the forest. That silence. It hit me the moment the echo of the blowout faded. No insects, no owls, not even the creak of branches in the wind, because there was no wind. The air hung still and heavy, pressing against the windows of my cab, like something solid. I told myself it was fine. Tires blow. It happens. I'd changed enough flats in my career that the process was almost automatic. Hazard lights on, grab the jack and the lug wrench from the toolbox, get it done, and get moving. 20 minutes, 30 tops. And I'd be back on the road with nothing to show for it but some grease on my hands and a story for the guys at the loading yard. I popped the door and stepped down onto the gravel. The cold hit me first. October in the Coast Range. The kind of chill that seeps into your bones even through a heavy flannel jacket. My breath fogged in the glow of my running lights, and I pulled my collar up as I walked around to assess the damage. The rear driver's side tire was shredded. Not just flat, destroyed. Ribbons of rubber hung from the rim like something had torn through it, though I knew that was just the way blowouts looked when you were running loaded. The rim itself had gouged into the asphalt before I'd gotten stopped, leaving a bright silver scar in the metal. I crouched down to get a better look, running my flashlight over the damage. The cold bit at my fingers as I poked at the remains of the tire, trying to figure out what had caused it. A nail? Road debris? Sometimes you hit something and it lodges in the rubber, wearing through slowly until the pressure wins and the whole thing goes at once. That's when I first felt it. The sensation crept up my spine like cold water, starting at the base of my skull and spreading down through my shoulders. The certainty that I was being watched. I straightened up slowly, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as I swept it across the tree line on the opposite side of the road. The Douglas firs stood like black pillars, their branches interlocking overhead to block out the stars. My light barely penetrated the first row of trunks before the darkness swallowed it whole. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. But the feeling didn't go away. Hello? My voice came out rougher than I intended, barely above a croak. Anyone out there? Silence. The kind of silence that felt deliberate, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I shook my head, trying to clear the paranoia. It was 2 a.m. on a road that saw maybe a dozen vehicles a day during working hours. There was no one out here. The blowout had rattled me, that was all. Adrenaline playing tricks on my nerves. I walked back to the toolbox, grabbed the jack and the lug wrench, and set to work. The jack slid under the frame without issue, and I started pumping. The rig rose slowly, groaning under its own weight, and I positioned the spare. Grateful I'd checked it last week and knew it had decent pressure. My hands found the familiar rhythm of loosening lug nuts, the physical work helping to settle my nerves. This was something I knew, something I could control. I was on the 3rd lug nut when the smell hit me. That same musk from 3 nights ago. Wet dog and copper, sharp enough to cut through the cold air. Strong enough that I stopped mid-motion, the wrench frozen in my hands. I turned my head slowly, scanning the tree line again. And I saw the eyes. They were maybe 40 yards away, deep in the first row of trees where the darkness grew absolute. 2 points of light reflecting the amber glow of my running lights, positioned high, too high, higher than my shoulder, higher than any deer's eyes would be or any bear's. These were at least 6 feet off the ground, maybe more, and they weren't moving, weren't blinking, just watching. I told myself it was a bear, a big black bear, standing on its hind legs to get a better view of the commotion. That's what bears did sometimes. They stood up. It was normal behavior, nothing to worry about, but bears blink. Bears shift their weight. Bears don't stand frozen like statues in the darkness, staring with the kind of stillness that felt deliberate, predatory. I forced myself to turn back to the tire. My hands were shaking now, the lug wrench slipping against the bolt. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Told myself to focus, to get the tire changed, to get back in the cab, and drive away from whatever my overactive imagination had conjured in the trees. The lug nut came loose. I moved to the fourth. The eyes were still there. I could feel them on the back of my neck like twin points of heat, burning through the darkness. I didn't look again. Looking would make it real. Looking would mean acknowledging that something was out there. Something that wasn't a bear, wasn't anything I could explain with rational thought. I yanked the blown tire off and wrestled the spare into place. My fingers fumbled with the lug nuts, cross-threading the first one, before I forced myself to slow down, to breathe, to do this right, because if I stripped the bolts, I'd be stuck here. Stuck here with those eyes watching from the trees. The smell grew stronger. That abertic copper and musk stench that seemed to coat the back of my throat that made my stomach clench and my skin crawl with the atavistic recognition. Some part of me, some ancient part buried deep beneath 11 years of hauling timber and drinking coffee at the timber lodge, knew what that smell meant. Knew it the way a mouse knows the shadow of a hawk. I got the spare on, got the lug nuts tight, lowered the jack with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. When I finally allowed myself to look again, the eyes were gone. I stood there for a long moment, flashlight beam trembling as I swept it across the tree line. Nothing. Just trees and darkness, and that oppressive, deliberate silence. The smell was fading now, carried away by some current of air I couldn't feel. I gathered my tools with mechanical efficiency, threw them in the toolbox, and climbed back into the cab. The door slammed harder than I intended, the sound echoing across the empty road. I locked it. I never locked my doors on rural runs. What was the point? But my hand found the button without conscious thought. My hands left smears of grease on the steering wheel as I pulled back onto the road. I drove faster than I should have on an unfamiliar spare. But I didn't slow down until the trees gave way to open farmland near the highway junction. The next morning I sat in my usual booth at the timber lodge, staring at a plate of eggs I couldn't bring myself to eat. Carol refilled my coffee without comment. But she gave me a look, the kind of look that said she could tell something was wrong but wasn't going to ask unless I wanted to talk about it. I didn't want to talk about it. What would I say? I saw eyes in the forest. I smelled something strange. I got spooked changing a tire and drove like a bat out of hell on a blown rim. But I found myself talking anyway, just the words spilling out before I could stop them. You ever hear of bears standing real still? I asked, keeping my voice casual, like not moving for a long time, watching. Carol paused, coffee pot suspended over my cup. Bears? Yeah, big black bear maybe. I saw one last night while I was changing a flat, just standing there at the tree line watching me. Didn't move the whole time. She finished pouring, set the pot down, and leaned against the booth across from me. Where at? FSR 1012, mile or so past the big turnout. Carol shook her head slowly. Don't know about bears standing still like that. They usually run off when they see headlights, don't they? Too many hunters using spotlights. That's what I thought. I wrapped my hands around the coffee cup, letting the heat seep into my stiff fingers. This one didn't seem bothered. Just stood there staring. How tall? The question caught me off guard. I looked up at Carol, at her weathered face and sharp blue eyes, and saw something there I couldn't quite read. Tall, I said finally. I mean, it was standing up. So, 7 feet, maybe more? She held my gaze for a moment longer, then straightened up and grabbed the coffee pot. Probably just a big one. They get big out in the deep forest, away from people, nothing to worry about. But there was something in her voice, something that didn't match the casual words, something that told me she knew exactly what I was talking about and had no intention of discussing it further. I spent the rest of that day researching black bears on my phone, squinting at the tiny screen in the dim light of my single wide. Black bears in Oregon topped out at around 600 pounds for the largest males. They could stand on their hind legs, but they rarely held the position for long. It was typically a behavior used to get a better view or smell of something that had caught their attention. They didn't stand motionless for minutes at a time. They didn't watch. I called the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife on my lunch break, feeling like an idiot as I explained what I'd seen to the bored-sounding woman who answered the phone. And you say it was standing upright? Yes, ma'am, for at least a minute, probably longer. At 2 a.m? That's right. A long pause. Then, sir, it's difficult to accurately judge what we're seeing in low light conditions. Our perception of size and distance gets distorted, especially when we're startled or under stress. What you likely saw was a normal-sized black bear that appeared larger due to the circumstances. It was at least 6 feet tall at the shoulder. I understand that's what it seemed like, but black bears don't grow that large, and they don't typically remain stationary when confronted with vehicle lights and human presence. My best guess is that you saw a bear that reared up briefly and then retreated into the forest while your attention was elsewhere. I thanked her and hung up, no more satisfied than I'd been before the call. The next few days passed in a haze of normalcy that felt increasingly fragile. I ran my loads, slept my daylight hours, drank my coffee at the Timber Lodge. I didn't take FSR 1012. I told my dispatcher the spare needed replacing and took a longer route that added 40 minutes to each run. She didn't question it. She was used to drivers having superstitions about certain roads, certain stretches of highway where someone had died, or where the curves were too tight or where the fog got too thick. I didn't mention the eyes to anyone else. Marcus had gone quiet since our last conversation, taking his loads and leaving without the usual small talk. Earl and Dale at the diner talked about football and the unseasonably cold weather and the new logging restrictions that were going to put everyone out of work. Normal things. Safe things. But I started noticing more. Dogs that wouldn't leave their porches. Cats that watched the tree line with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. The continued silence of the coyotes, which should have been howling every night as mating season approached. And then, 4 days after the tire blowout, I saw it again. I was running a light load back to the yard, taking the long route that kept me on paved roads, when I decided to stop at a turnout to take a leak. The turnout overlooked a valley that stretched toward the coast, and on clear nights, you could sometimes see the lights of Tillamook twinkling in the distance. I'd stopped there 100 times over the years. It was familiar. Safe. I killed the engine but left the running lights on, stepping down from the cab into the cold night air. The stars were bright overhead, the Milky Way a pale smear across the blackness, and for a moment I felt something almost like peace. Just me and the night and the vast indifference of the universe. I walked to the edge of the turnout, unzipping as I went, and that's when I saw it. Not the eyes this time, the shape. It was standing at the tree line, maybe 60 yards down the slope, silhouetted against the stars visible through a gap in the canopy. At first my mind tried to make sense of it, a dead snag maybe, a lightning-struck tree that had lost its branches and stood as a bare trunk. But trees don't have shoulders. Trees don't taper from broad shoulders to a narrow waist. Trees don't have heads that angle toward you, tracking your movement. It was huge. At least 7 feet tall, maybe more. It was hard to judge at that distance with nothing nearby for scale. The shape was wrong in ways I couldn't immediately articulate, proportions that didn't match anything I knew. The shoulders were too wide for the height. The arms, hanging at its sides, seemed to reach past where a human's would end. And the head was wrong. Even in silhouette, even against the dim light of the stars, I could see that the head was wrong. Too long, too narrow at the muzzle. Because it had a muzzle, I understood that now, understood it with a certainty that turned my bowels to water. Not a human head, not a bear's head. Something canine, something that belonged on a wolf. If wolves stood 7 feet tall and watched men from the darkness with the patient stillness of a predator that knows its prey cannot escape. I was still standing there with my zipper down, all biological urgency forgotten. The shape tilted its head. A slow, deliberate motion that I recognized instinctively, the way a dog tilts its head when it's trying to understand something, when it's processing information and deciding what to do next. That small, almost curious motion broke something in me, broke through the paralysis that had locked my muscles in place. I stumbled backward, hands fumbling with my zipper, eyes never leaving the silhouette at the tree line. The shape didn't move, didn't pursue. It just stood there, head tilted, watching me retreat. I made it to the cab somehow. I don't remember climbing the steps, don't remember slamming the door. But I must have done both. Because suddenly, I was inside with the door locked and the engine roaring to life. The headlights swept across the slope as I pulled out, and for one terrible moment they illuminated the tree line, casting long shadows back into the forest. The shape was gone. I told myself I'd imagined it. Told myself it was a tree, a shadow, a trick of exhaustion and paranoia and the lingering fear from the night of the blowout. I told myself there was nothing out there, nothing watching, nothing wrong with the forest that had been my workplace for 11 years. But when I got back to my single wide that night, I checked every lock twice. I pulled the curtains tight against the windows that faced the tree line at the edge of my property. I slept with the television on, volume turned low, just for the company of human voices. And in the morning I started looking for answers that I was increasingly afraid I'd find. The internet became my obsession over the next week. I searched every combination of words I could think of. Large predator Oregon, unknown canine sighting, cryptid Pacific Northwest, upright wolf creature. Most of what I found was garbage. Blurry photographs that could have been anything. Breathless accounts on forums that read like fiction, full of dramatic embellishments and convenient details that marked them as fantasy. But some of them were different. I found a thread on a hunting forum buried deep in the archives, posted by a user who deleted his account years ago. He'd been bow hunting for elk in the Coast Range, maybe 40 miles south of where I ran my routes. 3 days into his hunt, he'd started finding his camp disturbed each morning. Nothing taken, nothing damaged, just moved. His cookware rearranged, his sleeping bag unzipped, tracks around the perimeter that he couldn't identify. Too large for wolf, wrong shape for bear, with what looked like finger impressions at the front of each print. On the fourth night, he'd woken to something standing outside his tent. He described the smell first. Musk, he wrote. Like wet dog and rotting meat and something else, something that made his hindbrain scream, run, run, run. He'd lain there for 3 hours, not moving, barely breathing, while whatever it was circled his tent. When dawn came, it was gone. He'd packed out that morning and never went back. The thread had 12 replies, mostly mocking, but 2 of them were serious. 2 of them said they'd experienced something similar in the same general area decades apart. One mentioned a shape on 2 legs. The other mentioned eyes that reflected light at a height of 6 feet or more. I read that thread 4 times. Then I closed my laptop and sat in the darkness of my single wide, listening to the wind move through the trees at the edge of my property. The next night I had a run scheduled. Portland to the cutting site near the old Buster Creek Junction, picking up a load that had been staged there during the day. It was routine work, a route I'd driven hundreds of times over the years, but I sat in my truck for 20 minutes before starting the engine. My hands were shaking. Not the fine tremor of too much coffee, but a deep shaking that came from somewhere in my core. I thought about calling in sick. I had sick days saved up. I could take a week, maybe 2, wait for this to pass, wait for whatever was happening in the forest to move on or reveal itself as the product of an overworked mind. But bills don't pay themselves. The bank doesn't care if you've seen something impossible in the trees. I started the engine and pulled out onto the highway. The run was uneventful. I kept the radio on loud, classic rock from the Portland stations. Anything to fill the silence. I made good time to the cutting site, loaded up without incident, started the long haul back toward the mills. The night was clear and cold, the roads empty, and by the time I hit the halfway point, I'd almost convinced myself that everything was fine, that I'd let fear and isolation twist my perceptions into something monstrous, that the shape I'd seen was nothing but shadow and imagination and the natural paranoia of a man who spent too many nights alone. Then I crested the ridge above FSR 1012 and I saw it again. This time it wasn't just a silhouette. This time my high beams caught it full on, illuminating details that burned themselves into my memory like brands on livestock. It was crouched at the side of the road, maybe 30 yards ahead. Not standing, crouched, the way a man might crouch, nay, to examine something on the ground. Weight balanced on the balls of its feet. Its feet, not its paws, because those were feet. Wrong and twisted, but recognizably feet, with toes that ended in claws curved like fishhooks. The fur covering its body was coarse and gray-brown, the color of dead pine needles, and it lay in patches over muscle that bunched and shifted as the creature turned toward my headlights. Its hands were planted on the asphalt. Hands, not paws. Fingers too long, an extra joint maybe, tipped in the same dark claws as its feet. They were spread against the road surface like a sprinter in the blocks, ready to launch. And its face. The snout was long and narrow, wolf-like, but not quite wolf, with a broader forehead and set of eyes that faced more forward than any natural canine. The lips were pulled back, not in a snarl, but in something that looked almost like curiosity, revealing teeth that went further back into the skull than they should have. Too many teeth. Teeth for ripping, for tearing, for cracking bone and extracting marrow. The ears were pointed and mobile, swiveling toward the sound of my engine. For one frozen moment, maybe 2 seconds that felt like hours, we stared at each other. The creature's eyes reflected my headlights back at me, that same amber gold I'd seen at the tree line. And in those eyes I saw something that terrified me more than the teeth or the claws or the impossible anatomy. I saw intelligence. Not animal intelligence, not the cunning of a predator calculating the best angle of attack. Something deeper. Something that looked at me and understood exactly what I was, exactly what I was feeling, exactly how helpless I was in that moment. Then it moved. Not toward me. It rose to its full height. 7 feet, maybe more. The proportions even more wrong when it stood upright. The torso too long. The legs bent at angles that suggested they could move equally well on 2 legs or 4, and simply stepped backward into the tree line. One smooth motion, unhurried, almost casual, as if it had seen everything it needed to see. I drove past the spot where it had crouched, doing 60 on a road rated for 35. I didn't slow down until I hit Highway 6, and even then my foot stayed heavy on the accelerator. I made the delivery in record time, filed my paperwork without speaking to anyone, and drove straight home with every light in the cab turned on. That night I didn't sleep at all. The signs started showing up 2 days later. At first I thought I was imagining things, seeing patterns where none existed. The arrangement of my garbage cans, which I kept at the side of my single wide, seemed different when I came home from a grocery run. Not knocked over, not rooted through, just positioned slightly differently than how I remembered leaving them. I told myself I was being paranoid. Told myself the wind had shifted them, or a neighbor's dog, or the garbage collection service. Then I found the scratch marks. They were on the aluminum siding at the back of my trailer, the side that faced the tree line maybe 50 yards away. 4 parallel grooves, shallow but distinct, running vertically from a height of about 6 feet down to roughly 3. The metal was scored, not just scratched. Something had pressed hard enough to leave permanent marks. The spacing of the grooves matched what I'd seen in my headlights. 4 fingers, too long, tipped in claws. I stood there staring at those marks for probably 10 minutes. The morning sun was bright and warm on my back. Birds were singing in the trees, and everything about the day said normal, said safe, said nothing to worry about. But those scratches weren't normal. Those scratches meant it had been here, at my home, while I was inside, probably sleeping, probably dreaming about the shape in my headlights. It knew where I lived. I called in sick that night, and the next night, and the night after that. I told my dispatcher I had the flu, that I was running a fever, that I'd be back as soon as I could shake it. She sounded concerned. Asked if I needed anything. I almost laughed. What I needed was an explanation that didn't involve throwing out everything I knew about the natural world. During the days, I fortified my single wide as best I could. It was laughable, really. The walls were thin enough that a determined human could punch through them, let alone whatever that thing was. But I installed better locks on the doors, screwed the windows shut, bought a shotgun from a pawn shop in Vernonia, and a case of buckshot that I kept by my bed. I knew on some level that none of it would matter. I'd seen the size of that creature, seen the casual power in the way it moved. If it wanted to get inside, it would get inside, and my shotgun would do about as much good as a fly swatter. But I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. The fear was too big for that. On the 5th day, I drove into town to see Carol at the Timber Lodge. She was working the lunch shift, moving between tables with the easy efficiency of someone who'd been doing this job for decades. When she saw me come through the door, something flickered across her face. Recognition, maybe, or something else? "Victor." She said my name like a statement, not a greeting. "You look like hell." "Feel like it too." I slid into my usual booth, the one by the window where I could see the parking lot. "Coffee, please." She brought it without another word, but she lingered at my table longer than she needed to. Those sharp blue eyes studied my face with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "You seen something," she said, not a question. I wrapped my hands around the mug, let the heat seep into my palms. "What makes you say that?" "I know the look." She glanced toward the back of the diner, where Earl and a couple of other old-timers were deep in conversation. "Been seeing it on loggers and haulers for 40 years. Usually they drink themselves stupid or quit the job or both. Sometimes they stick around long enough to tell someone." She paused. "You want to tell someone?" I did. God, I did. For the weight of what I'd seen was crushing me, and every day I spent keeping it inside made it worse. But what could I say? What words would make her believe me? "There's something in the forest," I said finally. My voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. "Something big, something wrong. I've seen it 3 times now." Carol's expression didn't change. She didn't laugh, didn't dismiss me, didn't look at me like I'd lost my mind. She just nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something she already knew. "You talked to Marcus lately?" The question caught me off guard. "Marcus? No, he hasn't been returning my calls. His dispatcher said he's on leave." "Medical leave," Carol said. She looked over her shoulder again, then leaned closer. "Checked himself into a facility up in Portland 2 weeks ago. Mental health thing. His wife came through here looking for him before they found him in his truck on the side of Highway 26, just sitting there. Wouldn't drive anymore." "Couldn't," she said. A cold feeling spread through my chest. "What did he see?" "Didn't say exactly, but I heard enough." She straightened up as the bell over the door chimed. Another customer coming in. "You be careful, Victor. Whatever it is, it's been here longer than any of us, and it doesn't like being looked at." She walked away before I could ask her what she meant. I tried to find Marcus that afternoon, called the facility in Portland, but they wouldn't confirm or deny whether he was a patient. Called his wife's cell, but it went straight to voicemail. I drove by his house outside Vernonia, but the place looked deserted. Curtains drawn, no cars in the driveway, a pile of mail visible through the front window. He'd run. Whatever he'd seen, it had broken something in him, and he'd run as far and as fast as he could. I thought about doing the same, just packing a bag, getting in my truck, and driving until I hit somewhere flat and open and far away from any forest. Arizona, maybe, Nevada. Somewhere with nothing but desert and sky and not a single tree for miles. But I didn't have the money for that kind of escape. I didn't have anywhere to go, anyone to stay with. My brothers were scattered across the country, and we hadn't been close since our parents died. My ex-wife would laugh me off her property, and even if I did run, how long would I last? How long before I went the way of Marcus? Unable to function, jumping at shadows, checking myself into a facility because the memories were worse than the reality? No, I couldn't run. I had to understand what I was dealing with. Had to know the shape of the thing that was hunting me, even if that knowledge destroyed me. That night I sat on my porch with the shotgun across my lap, watching the tree line. The motion-activated floodlights I'd installed threw harsh white light across my yard, but they only reached maybe 40 feet. Beyond that was darkness, and beyond the darkness was the forest. I saw movement once around 2 in the morning. A shadow that might have been a deer, or might have been something else. It was there and gone in less than a second, too fast for my eyes to track. I didn't sleep until dawn broke over the coast range, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The next day I made calls to the sheriff's department to report unusual animal activity near my property. The deputy who took my report sounded bored. "What kind of animal?" "Large," I said. "Possibly a bear." "They'd send someone to check it out," he said, "but they were understaffed and it might take a few days." I hung up knowing no one was coming. I called Fish and Wildlife again. Got transferred 3 times before reaching someone who actually listened. But when I described what I'd seen, carefully omitting the more impossible details, all he could offer was the same dismissal. No wolves in the area. Black bears don't exhibit that kind of behavior. Maybe a cougar, though they usually avoid humans. He'd make a note of it, he said. "Thanks for calling. I even called the university in Portland, the biology department, asked if there were any research projects on unusual predators in the Coast Range." The graduate student who answered sounded confused, then annoyed when I couldn't clearly articulate what I was asking about. She gave me a website to report wildlife sightings and wished me a good day. No one could help me. No one would believe me if I told them the truth. And somewhere out in the forest, the creature was waiting, watching, scratching messages on the side of my trailer to let me know it knew exactly where I was. The night it came for me started like any other. I'd forced myself to take a run, a short one, local roads, to a pickup site and back. I couldn't keep calling in sick forever. Couldn't keep hiding in my single wide watching the tree line. I had to work. Had to maintain some kind of normalcy, even if normalcy felt like a thin sheet pulled over a void. The run went fine. Local roads, well lit for the most part. Traffic occasionally passing in the other direction. I made the pickup. Made the delivery. Started the drive back to my trailer with the radio playing low, and my eyes constantly checking the mirrors. I was maybe 2 miles from home when the engine coughed. Just once, a hiccup in the steady rumble. I watched the gauges, but nothing seemed wrong. Oil pressure normal, temperature normal, fuel at a quarter tank. Then the engine coughed again and died. The truck rolled to a stop on a stretch of road I knew well, a straight section that ran through second-growth timber, maybe half a mile from the nearest house. I tried the ignition once, twice, 3 times, nothing. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch, like something was blocking the fuel line or strangling the spark. I sat there in the sudden silence, gripping the wheel hard enough to turn my knuckles white. The night was dark. No moon. Clouds blocking the stars. My headlights illuminated the road ahead, but everything beyond their reach was black. I thought about staying in the cab, waiting until dawn. But my lights would drain the battery, and then I'd be sitting in pure darkness, with nothing between me and whatever was out there. I had to check the engine, had to at least try to fix whatever was wrong. I reached for the shotgun I'd started keeping in the cab. Then I saw the eyes. They were at the edge of my headlights, maybe 50 feet away. amber gold, reflecting the light, positioned at a height that meant whatever owned them was standing upright. They didn't blink. They just watched, waiting. The creature stepped into my headlights, and I saw it completely for the first time. Every detail I'd glimpsed before, the eyes, the silhouette, the partial views that my mind had desperately tried to explain away, came together into something that my brain simply refused to process. It stood at least 7.5 feet tall, maybe more, and it walked toward my truck with the easy, unhurried stride of something that had never needed to fear anything in its existence. The head was a wolf's. There was no other way to describe it. A long canine muzzle, ears that swiveled forward with predatory focus, a broader forehead than any wolf should have. But the proportions were wrong in ways that made my stomach lurch. The skull seemed too large, the jaw too heavy, packed with teeth that gleamed wet in my headlights. Too many teeth, I realized. Rows of them going further back than any natural mouth should allow. The body was where the horror truly lived. Massive shoulders, heavily muscled, covered in coarse gray-brown fur that looked like dead pine needles in the harsh light. The torso tapered to a narrow waist, but it was too long, stretched in a way that suggested the spine had more vertebrae than anything earthly. Arms hung at its sides, ending in hands, not paws, hands, with fingers that seemed to have an extra joint, each one tipped in claws curved like fishhooks. The legs bent backward at the knee, digitigrade like a dog's, but they supported that massive frame with obvious strength. It moved on two legs as naturally as I walked. This wasn't an animal rearing up to get a better view. This was something built to stand upright, something that had evolved or been made to move through the world this way. And the eyes, God, the eyes! Amber gold, forward-facing like a predator's. But there was intelligence behind them. Not animal cunning, not instinct. Something that looked at me and understood what I was feeling. Something that found my fear interesting. It stopped maybe 20 feet from my truck and tilted its head, that horribly familiar gesture I'd seen at the tree line 3 weeks ago. Curious, patient, like it had all the time in the world. I fumbled for the shotgun. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped it twice. The creature watched me struggle, that massive head cocked to the side, and I swear to God I saw something like amusement in its expression, like watching a mouse try to defend itself. I got the shotgun up, braced the stock against my shoulder, and tried to aim through the windshield. The barrel wavered. My finger found the trigger. The creature took another step forward. I fired. The blast was deafening in the confined space of the cab, the recoil slamming the stock into my shoulder hard enough to leave a bruise I'd feel for weeks. The windshield spiderwebbed but didn't shatter, safety glass holding together even as buckshot punched through it. The creature jerked. I saw fur ripple along its chest where the shot connected. It looked down at itself, then back at me, and its lips pulled back from those impossible rows of teeth. Not a snarl, a smile. I racked another shell, fired again. The creature didn't even flinch this time. It just kept walking toward my door, each step deliberate, claws clicking against the asphalt like a countdown. My hand found the door handle on the passenger side. I threw myself across the cab, spilling out onto the road, hitting the pavement hard enough to scrape my palms raw. The shotgun clattered beside me. I grabbed it, scrambled to my feet, and ran. Behind me, I heard the driver's side door tear off its hinges. The shriek of metal followed by the heavy thud of something hitting the road. The creature had simply ripped through the door rather than walking around. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life. 43 years old, out of shape, from too many hours behind the wheel and too many meals at the timber lodge, and I ran like I was 16 again, like my body remembered what it meant to be prey. The trees closed in around me as I left the road. Branches whipped my face. Roots tried to catch my feet. And behind me, I could hear it following. Not running. Walking, that same unhurried pace, the soft thud of those massive feet against the forest floor. It was faster than me. It had to be. But it wasn't chasing. It was herding. I burst through a gap in the undergrowth and found myself at the edge of a steep ravine. 20 feet down, maybe more, thick brush at the bottom. I could hear water running somewhere below, a creek swollen with recent rain. The creature emerged from the trees behind me. I spun, shotgun raised, knowing it wouldn't help. I had maybe 2 shells left. It had shrugged off buckshot at close range. But I wasn't going to die without fighting. It stopped at the tree line, 10 feet away. Close enough that I could smell it, that musk, that wet dog and copper stink that had haunted my nightmares for weeks. Close enough to see individual strands of fur, the way its ears rotated to track every sound, the rise and fall of its chest as it breathed. Close enough to see that it wasn't even winded, wasn't even trying. "What do you want?" My voice came out as a croak, barely recognizable as words. "What the hell do you want from me?" The creature tilted its head again, that curious, patient gesture. Then it did something that nearly made me fall to my knees. It pointed. One of those 2 long fingers extended toward me, claw glinting in the starlight that filtered through the canopy. Then it swept that finger around, indicating the forest, the trees, the darkness that surrounded us. A message, a warning. I don't know what it meant, not exactly, but the meaning was clear enough. This is mine, all of it. You're only here because I allow it. Then it turned and walked back into the trees, not running, not hurrying, just walking away, like a landowner who'd finished surveying his property and found everything in order. I stood at the edge of that ravine for what felt like hours, shotgun raised, waiting for it to come back, waiting for the killing blow that never came. Eventually, dawn began to lighten the sky. I found my way back to the road by following the creek downstream until it passed under a culvert. My truck was still there, driver's door lying crumpled in the road, engine still dead. I didn't try to start it. I just started walking. 2 miles to my trailer. I made it in about 40 minutes, in uni moving on autopilot, barely aware of my surroundings. When I finally reached my property and saw the single wide sitting there in the early morning light, floodlights still burning, I almost collapsed on the porch. Instead, I went inside, locked every door, and sat down on my couch with the shotgun across my lap. The shaking started then. Full body tremors that I couldn't control, my teeth chattering, my hands clenching and unclenching around the shotgun's grip. I looked down and saw that my palms were shredded from the asphalt, dried blood caked in the creases. My face stung where branches had whipped across it during my flight. My shoulder ached from the shotgun's recoil. I was alive. Somehow, impossibly, I was alive. I called in sick to work, again. My dispatcher's voice was sharp with irritation when I explained that my truck had broken down, that I'd need a tow. She asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine. The word felt like ash in my mouth. After I hung up, I sat there for a long time trying to decide what to do next. Report it? To who? The sheriff's department that couldn't be bothered to check on unusual animal activity? Fish and wildlife? Who had politely dismissed my concerns? The university where a graduate student had looked at me like I was wasting her time? I could see how that conversation would go. Yes, officer, I was attacked by a 7-foot werewolf in the forest. Yes, I shot it twice with a shotgun. Yes, it shrugged off buckshot and ripped the door off my truck. No, I don't have any evidence. No, I wasn't drinking. No, I'm not on drugs. They'd take my CDL. Mandatory psych evaluation for any driver reporting symptoms like mine. Hallucinations, delusions, paranoid ideation. I'd seen it happen to other guys. Once that flag went in your file, your career was over. And even if they believed me, which they wouldn't, what could they do? Send a deputy with a service pistol to hunt down something that had walked through buckshot like it was rain? Organize a search party to find a creature that had been living in these forests, according to Carol, for longer than any of us had been alive? No one could help me, no one would believe me, and reporting what had happened would only destroy what was left of my life. I didn't file a report. I told my dispatcher the truck needed mechanical work. I told the tow truck driver I'd hit a deer, and the damage to the door was from the impact. He looked skeptical. Deer don't usually peel doors off their hinges. But he didn't argue. People in Vernonia had learned not to ask too many questions about things that happened on the forest roads at night. For 2 weeks, I didn't leave my trailer. I called in sick until my sick days ran out. Then I stopped calling. I knew I was burning through what little goodwill I had with Cascade Pacific. Knew that 11 years of reliable service was being erased by what looked like a sudden breakdown. I couldn't make myself care. I slept during the day when sunlight poured through my windows and made the shadows retreat. At night, I sat on the couch with the shotgun, watching the tree line through gaps in my curtains. The floodlights helped, casting their harsh white glare across my yard. But they only reached so far. Beyond their reach, the darkness was absolute. Sometimes I saw movement out there, a shadow that didn't quite match the wind, eyes that reflected the light for a split second before vanishing. I never went outside to investigate. I just sat there clutching my shotgun, waiting for dawn. The supplies in my trailer ran out eventually. I had to leave, had to drive into Vernonia for groceries and gas. The first time I got behind the wheel of my personal truck, not the rig, which was still at the shop, with mysterious engine problems no mechanic could explain. My hands shook so badly I could barely steer. I took only daytime trips after that. Left the trailer at noon, made it to town and back before the sun dipped below the tree line. I stopped going to the timber lodge, stopped talking to anyone except the cashier at the grocery store, and those conversations were limited to how much I owed and whether I wanted a bag. Carol called me once, about a week after my last visit, asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine and hung up before she could ask anything else. I couldn't face her knowing eyes, her quiet understanding of something that shouldn't exist. My brother called too, Mark, the youngest, who I hadn't spoken to in over a year. He'd heard from someone, maybe my dispatcher, maybe my ex-wife, that I'd been having trouble. Asked if I wanted company, if maybe I needed to get out of Oregon for a while. Come stay with him in Arizona, he said. Desert air, open sky, no trees for miles. I almost said yes. Almost packed a bag right then, threw it in my truck, and pointed myself south until the forest gave way to scrubland and rock. But I knew it wouldn't help. I'd seen what was out there, and it had seen me. Distance wouldn't change that. Running wouldn't change that. Whatever contract existed between humans and that creature, I'd become a party to it the moment our eyes met across that tire change 3 weeks ago. So I stayed. And I started planning. 3 months after the encounter, I quit Cascade Pacific. The official reason was health problems, which wasn't entirely a lie. I'd lost 20 pounds from not eating. My hands still shook when I held them out straight. I couldn't sleep more than 4 hours at a stretch without waking to check the windows. A week later, I sold the single wide. Got less than I paid for it, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be gone from those 2 acres that backed up against state forest, that property I'd once thought was perfect in its isolation and quiet. I moved to Beaverton, a suburb of Portland, dense with houses and apartment complexes and strip malls. I rented a second-floor unit with neighbors on all sides. No forest within a mile in any direction. The complex had a parking lot lit by sodium lights that burned all night, bright enough that I could see every corner from my window. The day job came next. Warehouse work at a distribution center in Hillsboro, loading trucks instead of driving them. Half the pay I'd made hauling timber, but the hours were 9 to 5 and I never had to be alone in the dark. My coworkers thought I was strange. The quiet new guy who flinched at loud noises and didn't join them for beers after shift. But they didn't ask questions. I installed floodlights in my assigned parking space. Management complained, said it was against HOA rules, but I paid the fine and kept the lights burning. Some costs were worth paying. The routines helped. Day shift, daylight commute, evening meals in my brightly lit apartment with the TV always on. Church on Sundays, not because I believed anymore, but because the company felt safe. Grocery runs at noon, never after dark. I stopped checking the mirrors every few seconds, stopped waking at 2 a.m, certain that something was watching through the window. The tremor in my hands faded mostly. The weight came back, slowly. I never told anyone the full truth. My brother visited once, about these 6 months after I moved. Suggested we go camping just like we used to when we were kids. Sleep under the stars, cook over a fire, reconnect with nature. I nearly hit him. My fist was cocked back before I even realized what I was doing, and it took every ounce of control I had to lower my arm and walk away. He left that night, confused and hurt, and we haven't spoken since. My ex-wife heard through the grapevine that I'd quit trucking. She called to gloat, I think, to say she'd always known the loneliness of the road would break me eventually. I let her believe that's what happened. It was easier than the truth. Carol sent me a letter about 8 months after I left Vernonia. Just a few lines, no return address. "Glad you got out," she wrote. "Some do. Take care of yourself." I burned the letter. I didn't want any connection to that place, that forest, those roads I'd driven for 11 years before I learned what shared them with me. It's been 2 years now. I work days at the warehouse. I sleep with the TV on, some late-night talk show droning through my dreams. I go to church on Sundays, sit in the back pew, and let the hymns wash over me without meaning. I have a routine, a rhythm, something that passes for a life. But I'm not the same person I was before that night on Forest Service Road 1012. I don't go near forests. Any forests. A work friend invited me to his cabin in the Cascades last summer, and I made up an excuse so transparent he stopped asking. When the news shows footage of wildfires in the Coast Range, I have to change the channel. The sight of those trees, even burning, makes my heart rate spike. I check the windows before bed. Every night, without fail, I walk through my apartment and confirm that every lock is engaged, every curtain drawn. I know it's irrational. I'm in Beaverton now, surrounded by concrete and street lights and tens of thousands of people. Whatever lives in the Tillamook forest is miles away, separated from me by highways and suburbs and all the noise of civilization. But some nights, when the wind is right and the city goes quiet for a few hours before dawn, I swear I can still smell it. That musk, that wet dog and copper stink that means something ancient and terrible is nearby. I don't know what it was, not really. Not in any way I could explain to someone who hasn't seen it. I've read every account I can find, the forum posts, the books, the TV shows about cryptids and monsters in the American wilderness. None of them quite match what I saw. The Dogman legends come closest, but even those feel incomplete, like someone describing a hurricane after only seeing a gentle breeze. What I do know is this: it let me go. It was faster than me, stronger than me. It shrugged off buckshot, like I'd thrown pebbles at it. It could have killed me a dozen times over. When my tire blew, when I was crouched with the lug wrench, when I ran through the forest with branches whipping my face. At any point, it could have ended me, and there was nothing I could have done to stop it. But it didn't. It followed me, it watched me, it let me see it, really see it, in ways that I'll never be able to unsee. And then it pointed at the forest, delivered its message, and walked away. I don't know why. I don't know if it was curiosity or amusement or some kind of territorial display that I only survived because I was smart enough to run when running was still an option. I don't know if there are others like it or if what I saw was the only one, ancient and solitary, ruling over its domain in the Coast Range, like some kind of god. I don't know anything really. Just that it exists, that it's out there right now, walking through those forests I used to love, that every trucker and logger and hiker who passes through its territory is only alive because it allows them to be. Sometimes I wonder about Marcus. I never found out what happened to him, whether he recovered or whether he's still in that facility in Portland, staring at walls and refusing to speak. I hope he got out. I hope he found somewhere flat and open and far from trees, somewhere he can sleep through the night without dreaming of amber eyes in the darkness. But I suspect he didn't. Some people, when they see something like that, can't come back from it. They get stuck in the moment of revelation, unable to move forward, unable to forget. I was lucky. Or maybe I was just too stubborn to break. Either way, I'm still here, living my small life in my brightly lit apartment, going to my day job, sitting in church on Sunday mornings. I'm still here. Last month, I saw a news segment about increased wildlife activity in the Coast Range. Elk herds moving erratically, coyotes disappearing from usual territories, hikers reporting unusual silence in the deep forest. The reporter speculated about environmental changes, shifting predator populations, the usual explanations that don't explain anything. I changed the channel, made myself a cup of coffee, checked the locks on my windows. Outside, the sun was setting over Beaverton, painting the suburban sprawl in shades of orange and pink. In a few hours it would be dark. In a few hours, I'd be on my couch with the TV on, watching the shadows that gathered in the corners of my apartment. In the morning, I'd get up, go to work, and do it all again. That's what survival looks like now. Not adventure, not freedom, not the wide open roads I used to love, just routine, just endurance, just getting through each day without thinking too hard about what's out there in the dark. It's been 2 years since I saw it. I've never stopped wondering why it let me go. And I've never stopped being grateful that it did.